In a museum store in Liverpool, on a shelf that survived a German bombing raid in the Second World War, there is a set of teeth taken from a man who died almost 5,000 years ago. For over a century, nobody could get anything out of them. Egypt destroys DNA. The heat, the humidity in the tombs, the chemicals used on the dead, all of it turns the genetic code inside old bone into dust. 40 years of scientists trying and failing and giving up. And then a team cracked open the root of one of those teeth, pulled out a thread of surviving code, and read it end to end. What they found rewrote the story of who was standing in Egypt when the very first pyramids went up. Because this man was not who the textbooks said he should be. 1/5 of everything written into his body did not come from Africa at all. It came from somewhere else. Somewhere that, until this moment, was only supposed to be connected to Egypt through pottery and trade goods, not through blood. That is the payoff, and I am going to give it to you straight before we go one step further. This man carried the DNA of two worlds that were never supposed to have physically mixed this early. Around 80% of him traces back to the ancient farmers of North Africa, but the other 20% traces to Mesopotamia, the land of the Sumerians, the land between the two rivers in what is now Iraq. For over 100 years, the official position was simple. Egypt and Mesopotamia traded ideas. They copied each other's inventions. Writing appeared in both places. Similar pottery appeared in both places. And scholars always explained it the safe way. They said the ideas traveled, the objects traveled, but the people stayed home. This one skeleton says the people traveled too. Not a metaphor, not a symbol. Actual human beings moving between two of the oldest civilizations on Earth, mixing their bloodlines, generations before anyone thought that was possible. And here is what makes this more than a footnote in a journal. If the people were moving, then some of what we call purely Egyptian, purely homegrown, may have walked in from the outside. The knowledge, the techniques, the hands that shaped the first monuments. Think about what that quietly overturns. For most of the last century, there was a strong instinct in the field to treat ancient Egypt as a closed room, a civilization that invented itself, alone, along a single river, cut off by desert on every side, owing nothing to anyone. That image was comforting and clean. It was also, we now have reason to believe, wrong. Because the eastern edge of Egypt was never a wall. It was a doorway. And through that doorway, at least 20% of one of the oldest Egyptians we have ever read came the blood of Mesopotamia. That is the door this one man's teeth just kicked open. And behind that door are 3 separate clues, each one stranger than the last. There is the way he was buried, which contradicts everything about who he was in life. There is the reconstruction of his actual face staring out at us across 5,000 years. And there is the deepest question of all, the one about the builders themselves, the people who raised the pyramids out of the desert, and where they truly came from. We are going to walk through all 3, and by the end, you are going to see why some researchers went quiet, why the biggest claim in this story remains carefully unspoken in the official papers, and why the ground under the pyramids may be hiding a chapter of human history we were never taught. Let me tell you where this man was found, because the location is the first thing that does not add up. His remains came out of the ground in 1902, during the era when Egypt was under British colonial control, and archaeologists were pulling artifacts out of the sand at an incredible pace. The site is called New Wayrat. It sits about 265 kilometers south of Cairo, along the Nile, in Upper Egypt. He was not found lying in an open grave. He was found sealed inside a large ceramic pot, a pottery coffin tucked into a tomb cut directly into the rock. His knees were pulled up toward his chest. And that detail, the sealed pot inside the rock, is the only reason we are having this conversation at all. That container created a pocket of stable conditions. It shielded the body from the worst of the heat and the moisture that erases DNA everywhere else in Egypt. Without that pot, he would be gone, like every other set of remains that turned to genetic dust. He was a message in a bottle, and nobody realized it for 123 years. The remains were shipped to England and stored in Liverpool. They sat in a museum collection through 2 world wars. They physically survived bombing during the Blitz. And they waited. To understand why nobody had cracked them open before, you have to understand how badly ancient Egyptian DNA had beaten scientists in the past. This is a field littered with failure. Back in 1985, one of the founding figures of the entire discipline, Svante Pabo, a man who would later win a Nobel Prize, announced that he had recovered DNA from a 2,400-year-old Egyptian mummy of a child. It was hailed as the first ancient human DNA ever retrieved. And then, years later, Pabo himself realized the truth. The sequences were contaminated with modern DNA, possibly his own. The signal he thought was ancient was really just the present leaking into the past. That is how treacherous this work is. The heat and the humidity and the mummification chemicals do not just destroy the old code. They leave a vacuum that modern contamination rushes in to fill. And you can fool yourself into thinking you have found something when all you have found is yourself. For 40 years after that, Egypt stayed locked. A 2017 study managed to pull limited data from 3 mummies, but even that was partial. Fragments rather than a full book. So, when a team from the Francis Crick Institute in London and Liverpool, John Moores University, decided to try the new Wayrat man, they were walking into a graveyard of other people's failures. The lead researchers were open about it. Their expectations were low. The paleogeneticist who co-led the work, Pontus Skoglund, said flat out that mummified and ancient Egyptian remains are probably one of the worst possible ways to preserve DNA. They were bracing for another dead end. But their advantage was the pot. Because this man had never been mummified, he predated the widespread practice. He had simply been sealed in that ceramic vessel and left in a stable, shielded pocket of rock, which meant no chemicals had been poured into his tissue to shred the genetic material. They took samples from several of his teeth, then focused in on a specific hard layer near the tooth root called the cementum, a zone known for resisting environmental damage when everything else breaks down. They used a technique called shotgun sequencing to read whatever survived. And 2 of those samples held something real, not contamination, not a modern researcher's DNA smudged onto old bone. The exact mistake that had humiliated the field in the 1980s. They ran the authentication checks. This was genuinely ancient. And it was complete. For the first time in history, they had a whole genome from ancient Egypt. Not a fragment, not a handful of letters, the entire thing. And it was old. He lived somewhere between 4,500 and 4,800 years ago. That makes his DNA the oldest ancient Egyptian sample ever extracted. It places him right at the dawn of the Old Kingdom, the age of the pyramids, the window when Upper and Lower Egypt were being unified, and the first great pyramids were rising out of the desert. This was not a random Egyptian from some quiet century. This was a witness to the beginning. So they read him. And that is where the first real shock landed. Now, the mainstream story of ancient Egypt has always been careful. The consensus was that ancient Egyptians were essentially a local population tied to North Africa and the Near East, developing largely on their own along the Nile. Trade with Mesopotamia was accepted. Cultural borrowing was accepted. But direct genetic mixing at the very beginning, that was speculation. The kind of thing you were not supposed to state as fact without proof. This genome is the proof. About 77% of his ancestry, call it 80% in round numbers, matched populations linked to the Neolithic peoples of North Africa, closest to ancient groups from what is now Morocco. But the remaining portion, a little over 20%, matched populations from the Eastern Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia. And the researchers were clear about what that meant and did not mean. They could not pin down the exact moment the two lineages mixed. It may have happened over hundreds or even thousands of years, folding into his family line again and again. But the mixing was real. The West Asian ancestry was in his body. And that means that long before this man was born, people from the land of the two rivers had physically come to Egypt, settled, and had children with the local population. Here is why that matters so much. For a century, the similarity between early Egypt and early Mesopotamia was one of the great quiet puzzles of archaeology. Both civilizations exploded into complexity in almost the same narrow window of time. And they did it in parallel ways that were too specific to feel like coincidence. Both developed early writing systems at nearly the same moment, Egypt with its hieroglyphs, Mesopotamia with its wedge-shaped script pressed into clay. Both raised monumental architecture, the pyramids on one side, the great stepped temple platforms on the other. Both built complex administration, organized religion, and centralized states in the same few centuries. Even certain artistic motifs and building techniques echoed between them. And for generations, the safe explanation was always cultural diffusion. Ideas spreading along trade routes like a rumor passing between strangers who never actually touch. Objects changing hands at the edges of the two worlds. The people, in this version, stayed home. Only the concepts traveled. But this genome suggests something far more intimate. It suggests that when the ideas moved, the people carrying them moved too. That the pottery styles and the writing traditions and the building knowledge did not float across the desert on their own, like seeds on the wind. They walked inside human beings, who then settled in the Nile Valley, married into the local population, had children, and became Egyptian. And there is a crucial detail here that closes off the easy objection. Isotope analysis of this man's remains. The chemical signature locked into his body from the food and water of his childhood confirmed that he himself was raised in the Nile Valley. He was not a recent immigrant. He was born and raised Egyptian, which means his Mesopotamian ancestry did not walk in with him. It was already there, folded into his family line generations, maybe many generations, before he was ever born. The mixing was old, even from his point of view. And if that is true for one working potter buried in a pot at New Wayrat, a man of no royal importance, the obvious question becomes, how many others were carrying the same hidden inheritance? How deep does this go? Was this a trickle of a few travelers, or a current running through the entire population? One genome cannot tell us. But one genome just proved the current existed at all. That is the first clue. Now here is where it gets stranger, because this man's own grave contradicts his own body. Look at how he was buried. A sealed ceramic vessel, inside a rock-cut tomb, his body carefully arranged. That is a high-status burial. That is the kind of send-off you give someone who mattered, someone with rank, someone whose family had resources. This was before mummification became widespread. So an elaborate, protected burial like this signals real social standing. By the way, his body was treated in death. This man was somebody. But his bones tell the opposite story about his life. When the bioarchaeologists examined his skeleton, they found a body wrecked by physical labor. Severe arthritis, signs of osteoporosis, wear patterns that come from sitting hunched over a hard surface for hours, day after day, year after year, with the arms extended and the body locked in one strained position. His muscle attachment points, his joints, the specific way his bones were worn, all of it pointed to a life of relentless, repetitive, grinding work. They studied that pattern of damage and combined it with images from tomb paintings of that era showing craftsmen at work, and they reached a conclusion. This man was very likely a potter, someone who spent his life bent over a wheel, working clay, shaping vessels with his hands and his whole body. And that is a genuine contradiction that the researchers themselves flagged. A working potter, a manual laborer whose skeleton screams a lifetime of toil, was buried like a person of high status, in exactly the kind of protective tomb that a common artisan would almost never receive. Something in this man's life earned him a burial above his station. We do not know what. Maybe he was so exceptionally skilled that his craft raised his standing. Maybe pottery itself, the very technology that connects Egypt to Mesopotamia, carried a status in this early period that it later lost. Maybe there is a story here we will never recover. But the tension is real, and it is documented. His hands built things. His grave treated him like a king's servant, and his DNA came partly from 1,000 miles away. If you have made it this far, you already understand why this one skeleton is so important. So do this. Subscribe, because the next clue is the one that puts a human face on all of it. Literally. Because here is the part that stops people cold. They rebuilt his face. Using the shape of his skull, combined with the genetic predictions pulled directly from his DNA, a team reconstructed what this man actually looked like when he was alive. And this was not artistic guesswork with a paintbrush. They used a forensic prediction system that reads pigmentation directly from the genome, the same category of tool used in modern criminal investigations. The DNA predicted brown eyes, brown hair, and skin pigmentation the researchers described as ranging from dark to black. They deliberately reconstructed him without hair and without a beard, using only what the science could actually support, so they would not add a single detail they could not prove. And the result is a face. An older man, lined, weathered, staring slightly off to the side. A man who was somewhere between 44 and 64 years old when he died, which for that era was genuinely old. Old enough that in his own time, he would have seemed ancient the way a person in their 80s seems to us today. Sit with that for a second. We are looking at the reconstructed face of a specific human being who was alive when the first pyramids were rising out of the sand. Not a statue idealized by a royal sculptor. Not a golden mask designed to flatter a pharaoh. Not a painted fantasy on a tomb wall. The actual face of a working man, an artisan, rebuilt from his own skull and his own genetic code, with nothing added that the science could not defend. And the details of his life read off his skeleton make the face even more human. He was short by our standards, just over 5 feet tall. He was, for his era, extraordinarily old, somewhere in his 60s, an age so rare in that world that it would be like meeting someone well into their 80s or 90s today. He had survived. He had outlasted almost everyone he was born alongside, and his body carried the full cost of that long life. The arthritis, the worn joints, the damage of decades hunched over his craft. And when you know what is inside him, the face changes meaning entirely. This is the face of the fusion. Roughly 80% North African, a little over 20% Mesopotamian, blended over untold generations into one person, one potter, one pair of tired brown eyes. When you look at him, you are not looking at an abstraction or a statistic in a genetics paper. You are looking at the physical proof that Egypt, at its very beginning, was already a meeting point of worlds, a melting pot, thousands of years before we ever thought the pot existed. Every assumption about a sealed, isolated civilization growing alone in the desert dies in that face. He is the counter-argument, rebuilt in 3 dimensions, looking slightly away from the camera, as if he can still see something we cannot. And this is the moment to say what the study very carefully does not scream, but strongly implies. The connection between Egypt and Mesopotamia was not just about goods changing hands at some border market. One of the researchers put it plainly. Cultural exchange reflects the physical exchange of people. The ideas moved because the people moved. And when you follow that logic forward, It brushes right up against the biggest question in all of Egyptology. Who actually built it? Who raised the pyramids? Whose knowledge, whose hands, whose bloodlines produced the greatest construction project of the ancient world? For a long time, the popular imagination had an ugly, simple answer: that the pyramids were built by vast armies of foreign slaves, whipped into raising stone for a god king. That version has been demolished, and the evidence against it is overwhelming. Just beside the Giza Plateau, archaeologists uncovered an entire settlement, a lost city of the pyramid builders, and with it, the builders' own cemeteries. What they found rewrote the labor story completely. These workers were fed extraordinarily well. The evidence indicates that the roughly 10,000 laborers working on the Great Pyramids were supplied with something like 21 head of cattle and 23 sheep sent to them every single day, hauled in from farms across the region. Slaves are not fed prime beef. The men worked mainly in 3-month shifts, rotating in and out. And when they died, they were not dumped in pits. They were buried with care, in their own tombs, positioned according to Egyptian beliefs about the afterlife, surrounded by jars of supplies for the journey beyond. Their graves held no gold, which is precisely why tomb raiders left them alone for thousands of years, and precisely why they survived to tell us the truth. These were not slaves. They were skilled, paid, respected, and homegrown Egyptian workers, proud enough of their labor that they wanted to be buried in the shadow of what they built. But this genome adds a twist to that proud story that nobody can fully close yet. If Egypt's foundational population already carried Mesopotamian ancestry, if the fusion was already baked into the Nile Valley by the dawn of the Old Kingdom, then those proud Egyptian builders were themselves the descendants of that fusion. The lost builders in the title are not aliens, and not foreign slave masters, and not some vanished race. They are something quieter and far more interesting. They are a mixed people, a population whose roots reached beyond Egypt's own borders into the land of the two rivers, and whom history later flattened into a single, tidy word: Egyptian. The builders were never lost in the sense of vanishing. They were lost in the sense of being simplified. Their true ancestry sanded down into a myth of pure isolation. This genome is the first crack in that myth. Now, I have to be honest with you, the way a real investigation has to be honest, because there is institutional caution wrapped around this entire discovery, and it is important. This is one man, a single genome, and every serious scientist involved in this work said so out loud. Yahia God, a geneticist at Egypt's National Research Center, praised the study and then immediately cautioned that a single individual might not represent the entire gene pool of ancient Egypt, which was almost certainly a mix of many ancestries. Another co-author, Linus Girdland Flink, went further and pushed back directly on the most exciting interpretation. When asked whether this potter was one of the actual pyramid builders, he called that pure speculation, and he stressed that to really know who built the pyramids, you would need the genomes of the actual workers. And we do not have those yet. The team was careful, almost to the point of frustration. They would not let the story run ahead of the evidence. And notice what that means for us. The single most explosive version of this discovery, the idea that the builders of the pyramids were partly Mesopotamian in origin, is exactly the claim the researchers refused to make on the record. Not because it is impossible, because they only have one man, and one man is not a population. So, does this one skeleton prove that the pyramids were built by a lost people from between the rivers? No, it does not. That is the honest answer, and anyone selling you certainty is lying to you. But here is what it absolutely does prove, and this is the part that survives every ounce of skepticism. It proves that ancient Egyptians were not a sealed, isolated population, growing alone by the Nile. It proves that as early as the dawn of the Old Kingdom, real people from Mesopotamia had already settled in Egypt, and mixed their blood into the local line. It proves that the cultural similarities between the two civilizations were probably driven by human migration, not just the passing of ideas along a trade route. And it proves that DNA can now be pulled from ancient Egypt at all, which for 40 years was thought to be nearly impossible. That last point is the quiet earthquake under this whole story, because it means this potter is not the end. He is the first. And that is the thread that will not let go of you. This is a single data point in what should be a vast, hidden data set. Egypt has been called a white spot on the map of human genetic history, a giant blank where one of the most important civilizations that ever existed should be. Hundreds, even thousands of ancient genomes have been recovered from other parts of the world. Neanderthals, Denisovans, humans from 45,000 years ago. But Egypt stayed dark because its climate ate the evidence. Now, one thread of surviving code has been read, and it already contradicts part of what we assumed. So imagine the second genome, and the 10th, and the 100th. Egypt has an ongoing national project aiming to sequence the DNA of its own ancient dead, potentially hundreds of mummies. Every one of them is a sealed message we have not opened. And if a single potter, buried by accident in a pot that happened to protect him, can push the fusion of Egypt and Mesopotamia back thousands of years earlier than anyone believed, then what is waiting inside the ones we have not read yet? What does the second one say? What does the burial of an actual pyramid worker say, if we ever find one preserved well enough to read? That is the chapter of history that is missing. Not a myth about gods descending from the sky. Something more grounded and, in its own way, more staggering. A real movement of real people across the ancient world, carrying knowledge and craft and blood from the land of the two rivers into the valley of the Nile, generations before the first great stone was set in place. A fusion so old that Egypt forgot it had ever happened and buried it, quite literally, in the ground. We only know because one man's teeth outlasted 5,000 years of heat, and 2 world wars, and a bombing raid, and 123 years of sitting forgotten on a shelf, waiting for someone to finally ask him where he came from. He is still there, in that museum in Liverpool. His face has been rebuilt, and it looks back at us now, older than writing, older than the pyramids he may have helped inspire. And the rest of them, the thousands of others sealed in the Egyptian dark, are still waiting, still unread, still holding the answer to a question we have only just learned how to ask. If you want to see what else the ancient dead have been hiding from us, watch the next investigation on screen right now.